everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of the I Am an Icon podcast. Today, with me, I have two lovely ladies from Transforming Generations who I'm super, super excited to talk about today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having us.
So, as we talk about, transforming generations, that is huge. Like having that as a name of an organization, it really excited me. I want to talk about how you got started with Transforming Generations, because from my understanding, it's a new organization. Is that correct?
That is correct. We're fairly new. Um, we were actually formed by community members in 2015, and it was just a group of us who really had no relationship with each other, but except through our interest in, understanding the possibilities of ending gender-based violence in our community. We came together, and then we decided to incorporate in 2016 as a Minnesota nonprofit. Um, and it took a lot of work just to even understand like the name of what it really meant. It was very intentional. We did a lot of just analyzing what we wanted to do, and so we came up with a name. We had no staff in 2016. It was just a lot of volunteers. We were hosting a series of just speaking events and community education on what gender equity looks like and could look like in our community, what community solutions to end gender-based violence could be. And then it was not until 2019 when we actually got funding, and then eventually got our 501c3. And so now we are a nonprofit located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And our mission is to organize, educate, and transform cultural and power dynamics to end gender-based violence.
Wow, that is powerful. And can you talk a little bit more about where the need was to create something as amazing as this?
So I've been talking. Say, did you want to add, and then I could add some more because you are, I would say our frontline heroes and who are doing this work.
No pressure at all. No.
Yes.
My name is Say. Use she, her pronouns. I'm the Queer Justice Director and Mental Health Therapist at Transforming Generations. And so, yeah, I think that, we just recognize one, that a lot of our community members weren't getting the support that they need in mainstream agencies. And I think that this is because there's so much cultural nuances there, right? And then our mission, I think that the reason it's so big, right, it's about cultural transformation because we recognize that it's beyond just the domestic violence. It's the culture, and it's the folks who are silent as it's happening, and the folks who don't have the tools, right? And so we want to pollinate the whole community, get them to understand how domestic violence works. And so I think that, our agency is unique in that way. And I also um, see that we work with folks who've caused harm, right? And I think that that's very different for the agencies that exist right now, right? And I think for us, we see it as these folks are also our community members, and so we want to invest in helping them also heal and change and transform the ways that they have been doing things for a really long time. Lee, would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, I kind of want to just jump. I know we've been talking about culture, and I know one thing that we thought about as we were forming, that it's not really about our culture, like our Hmong culture, but it is really, we're talking about the culture of patriarchy, right?
Mhm.
And how that shows up and how that dictates cultural practices. And so that it may look different in every single community, but we know that the root cause is patriarchy, right? So I want us to be clear about that. And we're looking at what does gender-based violence look like in our community, and how does patriarchy and how that, the practices of patriarchy shows up, and how that upholds certain power, how that controls decisions and lives of individuals.
I love how you point out just there's a bigger system, that
Hmm.
is contributing to the violence in our communities. And like you said, there may be differences, but there's a bigger system that we're all interconnected to. Can you define what you mean by gender-based violence for those who don't quite understand that term.
So I will try to define it and say, please add to it. So when we're talking about gender-based violence, right? I think when folks thinks about domestic violence, people always talk about the gender. It's a binary gender. But what we see is patriarchy actually, right, dictates and tells us that there's only two gender, and we know that that's not true. And it says, this is how these two genders should be in relationship with each other, and how men and women should be together, how male or female, should not be together. And when they are not in those relationships, but they don't um, interact in those norms that are set up by patriarchy, then you're out of line, right? And then there's violence that's caused. And so when we look at gender-based violence, we're looking at the whole spectrum, how everyone, is affected by violence, right? And not just, male, female. So I know
Wow.
it's a really broad brush. I don't know, say you could define it way better than I could.
No, I think what you have is great, right? And I think that people often talk about it as how how a specific gender experiences violence, right? Like you experience this violence because of the gender, and oftentimes it's women and queer folks that they're talking about, right? And so the way we see it is that gender-based violence is this huge umbrella, and that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, falls underneath that, and that the conditions of patriarchy, right, within gender-based violence is what contributes to domestic violence,
Mm.
because you see the ways in which people make assumptions about gender, right? And because, for example, they'll say because you're let's just think about it in terms of like a heterosexual couple, right? Like I'm a male and I should have more power than you, and you're a woman, and because you fit this box, you should act this way. And when you don't act this way, then you receive violence, right? And so that's one piece of it. And then I would say too, one really important aspect at Transforming Generations is that we're about queer justice, because we know that when folks don't fit into those boxes, they receive harm too. So if I'm a queer woman and I'm not in a relationship with um, um, somebody that's male, right, I would
Mhm.
experience violence, right? And that could be in the form of corrective rape. That could be being disowned, right? Those kinds of violence. And then additionally, like folks who are trans, right? Like if you don't fit this cisgender box, you also experience violence, and people shame you, and people do all sorts of things. And so we are, when we talk about gender-based violence, we include all of that, because that's those are the conditions that make domestic violence um, happen, right? Why folks it's those are the conditions that people come in, the assumptions and how they've been conditioned, and then they come into relationships and they enact on those things.
Wow. It just makes me think too, like, and I'm so glad that your organization, has that focus because, like you said, if you're not fitting in a box, you're not going to speak up. You're not going to get the services that everyone's getting or, should have. You're not going to have that equality. And, it makes me think of even just some examples of, those who are not in a hetero, sexual or tradition, however they want to say, type of relationship. And, if they're calling the police and it doesn't look the same or they're not going to get the same treatment, they're going to be judged. And like that is, I think, such a powerful focus that your organization is taking upon themselves. And I really, really appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And then even in your mission, I hear, a lot about just the cultural piece. Are there some cultural differences that you see in your community when it comes to violence? Like, can you talk a little bit about like that history and like where do you see it as today?
Sure. I think we start talking about how patriarchy really dictates cultural practices. And so that's the nuances that we're talking about, right?
Mm.
So, power control is still, and violence shows up in all communities. And we want to say, we know that, there's no culture out there that, supports or condones domestic violence, but it's really patriarchy, right? That really dictates. And for us, I know that what, a lot of situations that we've dealt with in like in the Hmong community is abusive international marriages or relationship that
Mm.
has to do with the fact that we're also a diaspora community, You know, we were refugees and immigrants. And so then that form of relationship happens in our community. We see that quite often. I would say probably last 2 decades, we've seen more of that, where there's marriages internationally, and then there's that control that happens. Um, Other types of how gender-based violence or that's linked to cultural our community um, can also be elder abuse.
Mm,
We talk about what does elder abuse for us is holding individuals in place because they don't have the power to make certain decisions about their afterlife, right? What happens to them spiritually after they pass on, transition on. And so then that is a form of control. It's also part of the domestic realm.
Mm. Yeah, I want to go back to what you were saying earlier, right, Lee? Because I think that when people hear culture, they automatically think about like our racial culture, right? Like
Yes.
yeah.
among folks, how does it
Yep.
look like? And I think that for any community, like nobody wants violence, right? Nobody condones that in all cultures, and we know that domestic violence, intimate partner violence happens all across like everybody experiences it. And I
Mm,
think that the difference in each of our communities are those nuances that you talk about, right? And so all of our victim survivors experience physical abuse, right? Financial abuse, all of that, power and control. But it's the nuances, like you're sharing, Lee, right? Like for Hmong folks, especially the ones that who still follow what we call shamanism, right? Is that when you pass away, it's your husband's family that has to do the funeral rites for you, right? And for us, it's not like how a lot of mainstream does it, right? It's not a 4 hour wake, or it's
mhm.
3 days of like sending you back to where you came from, right? And I think that um oftentimes when women get divorced, right, that's what they fear, is that we won't in our when we die, we won't get that proper burial, and if we don't get that proper burial, we won't make it to the next life, right? And
Wow.
so those are the little nuances that I think a lot of other agencies, or just the way that we talk about domestic violence in our community, in the Hmong community, looks different. And I think that it's those little nuances, the dynamics that make it a little bit different for us.
Wow, that puts it in really, really good perspective. Even just for me, like you said, when we talk about culture, we go straight towards, but it's a lot deeper than that. And so as I was taking time to even look at your organization's website, I got really excited about seeing opportunities for like healing practices. And I don't always see that on sites, when I'm looking at like domestic violence sites or organizations who are, supporting people, victims and survivors, you kind of go straight to like certain things like, okay, here's a resource to escape. But one thing that really drew to me to your website was like, you have these healing practices, and I was super excited to learn like more about this. So can you share some of the healing practices that your organization is currently offering?
Yeah, yeah, I'm super excited about that. But before that, there's like a couple more points I want to touch on,
Yeah.
because it's gonna go into how we do our healing, right? And I think that going back to just the dynamics, that we've seen in the Hmong culture, is that oftentimes in domestic violence, there's the secondary violence that happens, right, from the in-laws, from mothers and fathers. And I think that for victim survivors, they're often pushed to leave the community, but then also pull to stay in their relationships. Otherwise, they face being labeled as like this bad woman, right? And I think that oftentimes when victim survivors leave, they have to go and find a different Hmong community in a totally different state, right? Because the shame is so thick, and that because when you are married into a family, you kind of the traditional, like what we've always known is that you kind of let go of your friends and you focus just on your husband's family. But when you divorce, that's your whole support system
Right.
that you just lost, right? And then And we also recognize that, some of the Hmong social and familiar practices help function as a protective factor to stopping and preventing the violence too. And so, of course, we also have our own practices that are healing. And one of the biggest thing that we've been talking about is this concept of Ketai versus Kecho, right? Which is Ketai is like what the practice actually, the law, like, I don't want to say the law, but then for folks to understand, it's like the law, the policy, right?
Mhm.
And then we have the Kecho is how people practice the policy, and it's that piece. That creates the conditions for the violence, or any other, for the violence that happens to women, girls, queer, and gender non-binary folks. And we learn this through talking actually to Hmong elders, who have been practicing for a really long time, and they practice a little bit different. And so we have been learning about that. And I want to bring all of that back into our healing, because the way we do healing is different, right, at Transforming Generations. And so we offer the talk therapy, right, the mental health stuff, and within that it's individual therapy, right. It's we also offer couples therapy, but that is, we're very particular about when we do this, because if there's domestic violence present, we won't do couples therapy. And then we have play therapy for children, right? Like that's the, the talk therapy stuff we do. But then we recognize, because of the women survivors losing their whole social support, right, once they leave their partners, is that we have to create different ways of them connecting and bonding, and creating stronger social support. And so through that, we have our garden. It's a healing garden that my colleague my thong has been doing for years, and it brings them back to what our people as Hmong people have always been doing, and that's been gardening, farming, and so this is the ancestral wisdom, right? And then we do it in such a way that is community driven, and everybody is doing it together, and you're connecting, you're bonding. And I think that sometimes, oftentimes in domestic violence, you experience so much isolation within that relationship, but also once you leave. And so this enables them to also start, building again, and having that social bonding that they've missed for so long. And so we offer that. I think that our programs, we have, the support group for queer and trans folks called Shiloh Circle, right? And it's also because when queer and trans folks come out, they're also really isolated. And then, of course, our Hmong queer, and trans community is so small. And so this virtual element really helps bring folks together and enables folks to meet with each other. And then we have our youth program that we're building. And what I love about it is we currently have a program called Adventure Time. And it's young folks going out into the park systems, and they're learning how to um, set up tents, right? Like do all the outdoor stuff, canoeing, and if you were doing some balancing, I forgot what it's called, balancing on a log in water, like things that they're not used to, especially when, like, just right now technology is so big, and so everybody want to be on Roblox and whatever. But I think that the unique thing about young folks, youth, and children in domestic violence family, in families where domestic violence is happening, is that they oftentimes end up in parentified roles, or they don't get to be kids because they have to be the older sibling watching over their siblings. They have to be helping with household stuff. And so this time, when they come to Adventure Time, is actually a time for them to just be kids, right? And do what they want to do, play and engage with other peers. And for kids, I mean, that's how they talk, right? That's how they communicate, is through play, and that's how they learn. And so it's a really big element in healing for young folks, to bring them in and do this with them. And I think that one of the biggest um, factor here is that when they come in, they meet other folks, other kids who come from families that have domestic violence. And I say this because a lot of times they think they're the only ones, or they think their family is so weird and different, and they want to be in a normal family, right? And then they meet other kids, and they're like, oh, I'm not by myself, right? And I think that that is the biggest thing in shutting down shame, right? And we know that in our victim survivors too,
Mhm.
is that if you are silent, right, and when people are silent, you that's where shame thrives. And so in connecting with other victim survivors, that's how you begin to challenge shame, and that's how you begin to heal. And so I love our adventure time. I love our youth program, because that's what it does for all, for our families. And then lastly, we have our Sinino program, which is us working with Hmong men who have caused harm, right? And a lot of them come through the court system. Then we do have a couple who are voluntarily coming, and I think that if we want to create that big cultural transformative change that we talk about, that means we have to also be working with people who are causing harm, right? And I know that a lot of people won't agree with that, but they are our community members. And I think about this model of, like, people catching babies down at the river. Like, we can't just keep catching babies. We got to get to the root of it and to be like, what happened to
Mm.
you that led you here, and how you cause all this harm, and how do we change that for you and for future generations. Hey, would you like to add anything else?
No, I think you cover the whole spectrum. From our young folks that we work with, the women we work with, our survivors, victims, to those who cause harm, and we serve because we're thinking about this work for our entire community, right? We're transforming. We want to transform our community. We think about the possibility for everyone and not just for some.
Oh, and this is so cool. I'm so excited about this. But because we recognize, like, talk therapy is not everything, right? It's healing for many folks, but we also recognize that in the Hmong community, healing has always been in our bodies too.
Mhm.
And so we're starting to build our resource list of Hmong healers who are very gifted in herbal medicinal plants, right? Because that's what we've always been doing, and why would we not continue to do that as part
Right.
of a healing? And then coining, right? So sometimes when our body aches, we coin ourselves, and that, like, releases all the tension and all the nasty stuff in our bodies. And so we're starting to build a list of that, because we want healing to be holistic, right? And not just around the mental health, but also the physical health, right? And we know that those are connected, right? If you're not taking care of your mental health, it's gonna make you sick. Your body is gonna tell you to stop and to rest and to take care of your mental health. And that's why a lot of folks actually end up really sick, right? Like with diabetes, high blood pressure, all of those things. If your mental health is not well, you're going to be eating whatever you want, right? And sometimes that's not the most healthiest choice for us. And so we're just recognizing how all of these things connect to each other too. And so I'm super excited about that. I want to experience it myself and also learn how to do it. And so that's kind of the direction we're moving in with our healing work.
Oh my gosh, my heart is like full. Just like hearing everything that you two have talked about and seeing the bigger picture, and like you building this ecosystem around families, not just, one individual. You're giving everyone the opportunity to be better within their communities. And to me, that is so powerful. And I think I wish, I should say, more people would take that approach to ending this issue, ending the systematic. To me, I see it as a public health issue always, because, a lot of what we learn and a lot of where we get our, energy is from in the home. And so if our homes are not well, when I leave out of there, nothing in my world is going to feel really well, or it's going to not feel, real or connected to me. And so I love, again, my heart is so full with everything that you're doing around healing and the activities, and also what you're providing those children. And like you said, they may feel like they're the only ones that are in this, but then having that space to like develop that trust and to find others who can relate to them is so huge as they grow and develop and heal from their own stories. So I really just appreciate all of the work you're doing there. So I do want to kind of ask, because I know, even for me, having personal experience from domestic violence, have either of you ever experienced it, ever in like your childhood, adulthood?
So, in thinking about this question, this is a really like big question. But the way I really thought about it was, well, I think a lot of us grew up experiencing domestic violence, right? And sometimes not even knowing it, not being able to name it. I think, I can say for Say and I, we grew up in, understanding, right, and seeing how patriarchy like really dictated our life, how it
Mhm.
wanted us to be certain ways. And so I think just those experiences and the what we have done to push back, and to really still work on ourselves, right? And I think we're talking about healing. I also want to say some of the healing practices, it's not just us offering it, but it's also us experiencing it. So we do it at TG too, knowing that all of us are, survivors of domestic violence, right? Whether we've been in an intimate relationship or not, but we've all seen it. Whether it's seeing the physical harm that I've seen in others, knowing of individuals or myself. So I think that really just, I think that's what brought us together to say we know we've seen these harms in our community. Um, so I feel like I'm providing this really big answer, but
Mhm.
I think a lot of us are still working through that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Lee. I mean, I think about like my childhood, just thinking about these aunties that came to our house, right? Seeking for support, and thinking about these mediations we've seen with relatives, right? Like my parents would take us to, and I think that when you see that as a young person, it really impacts the way you see yourself of like, ooh, I gotta be among that or among women that follows like the rules, or I'm gonna end up like that person over there, right? Like I think that is ingrained in such a young age. And for me, I know there was domestic violence in my family, right? But here's the thing though, when people hear domestic violence, they automatically go to physical abuse,
Hmm.
but it's more than that, right? It's the financial abuse, it's the emotional abuse, it's the small threats, right? The manipulation using children and pets, right? All of that, that's present, whatever it takes to gain power and control and to keep somebody. And I think that people often look over all of those things and they think that, oh, um in order for it to be domestic violence, there has to be bruises, right? Things like that. And so I really want people to think about that too, because, in listening to that question, I was like, wow, in my childhood, where has this shown up? And actually, I also think that it is those moments that have brought us into this work, right? And that we see the bigger things, the patriarchy, the sexism, all of that, and the ways people are complicit in that, that has continue to allow these things to happen. And so that has brought all of us here. And for me, I think, it's I don't talk about it a lot, but I am a victim, a survivor, right? And but I will say that it has taken me 10 years to get to this point of saying, wow, I was one, I am one. And it's because of the way that domestic violence is talked about,
Mhm.
that it has to be physical, right? And it's impacted me in all of my relationships all the way to until today. And I think that a lot of other folks, because they didn't get that education, they didn't know about these dynamics early on. They didn't know that they're in that situation, or they don't know the red flags, right? And I think that that's why it's so important for us to do this work, and that community education is a really big part of it. And I also want to say too that my relationship was a queer relationship, and it wasn't ever talked about, right? Because people don't want to talk about intimate partner violence in queer and trans communities, right? Because we already experienced a lot of homophobia, and we want to protect our image of who we are as queer and trans folks. And so I want to, I'm sharing that very, that private piece about myself, because I think this is a really important dynamic. And this is why our queer justice program exists, is because of this. And we want to change it. We want to talk more about it.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for sharing something so close to you. I'm a big believer that whenever you get to share your own personal experiences, it's a healing for yourself, but also for us. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate where you talk about the point even just around queer justice. And, a lot of what I'm learning is when you're already someone who has been discriminated against, towards, that's just another layer, right? And like you said, it's harder to speak up when you're already being discriminated, whether it's your skin color, your sexuality. And it's just, I feel like that's another big barrier for people to really take the opportunity to speak up, because they already are feeling like this is the reaction that I'm going to get, So I really do appreciate you speaking up about that. So with all this great work, I know that like in every field there comes challenges. What do you feel like is the biggest challenge when you're out in the community and really trying to make an impact?
When you have been talking a lot, so want to give you an opportunity to also talk.
So I would say biggest challenge that we've experienced. It's really, I think for advocates and organizations who are doing this work, I think there's still a lack of understanding, right, from the larger community. And I think a lot of times we get blamed for breaking up families.
Mm,
Um, because I know that our system that we live in, especially the legal system, wants families to stay together. um, but we know, right, sometimes that just can't happen. And so then advocates and organizations who are supporting survivors are blamed for breaking that, right? um, we're also blamed for leading women to divorce or dissolving their marriage.
mm,
um, and that we know that that's a challenge that we see. um, and then we also know that gender-based violence is challenging and complex, so it's more than just what we see or understand as power, right? And so I think that's one of the challenges, is how do we really understand gender-based violence. I think it's really hard when we're all swimming in it to really know what it is. um, I think we continue to see those in power who are continuing to silence survivors and victims and advocates. And this also includes the system. We know that folks who control and power, they use the system sometimes. They use the system against victims and survivors, and that is daunting because we're fighting a whole system. Um, we continue to see that survivors and victims, their stories are invisible, right? It's hard for a lot of them to even share. It takes time. I think one thing that really resonated with the work that we do is that we ourselves at TG, we talk about traumas, our own traumas. Sometimes we don't even realize our own traumas until it's happening, and then we get to call each other out and say, hey, that's a trauma response. And so that's part of the invisibility. So
mm.
even us as advocates, we're dealing with that. um, and then a lot of times I know that we always talk about, let's believe folks who are victims and survivors, right? One of the biggest challenges is just believing their stories, right? Hearing them out, and not questioning, not doubting. I would say it's those really abstract, those, um, you know, it is those things that I've just named that are the biggest challenges.
And even just like your analogy around like we're all swimming in it, so it's so it can be chaotic sometimes. And wow, I'm blown away by the things you've said, but it's so important that people hear this, because I think there is this disconnect, and like people are not always believing stories, or their survivor doesn't want to speak up because they've been gaslighted their whole relationships, and they've been told that they're delusional, that they're not worthy. So it's hard to even for them to speak up, because they're trying to justify what is even going on in their lives. And so I really do appreciate you saying that, and I think more people need to hear that for sure. Wow. So, in every podcast episode, I always want to know, who are people's icons. And if you don't know what an icon is, icon stands for I can overcome negativity. And I truly believe that we all have been icons in our lives at some point. We've overcame something. So I just kind of want to know, who are those icons in your lives? Who are those people that you looked up to, that have overcame something and really kind of helped shape you know who you are today?
I could start first and then say you could add more, because I
Yeah.
think I was thinking about this. And I would say, it's not like celebrities or anybody, but for me, it's really my mother. And I know that we're still working on overcoming, both her and I. I think she's been my biggest challenge, but she's also been my biggest source of strength. just because of what she has allowed me, and her relationship with me has allowed me to become who I am. So I would say that is she is the icon that I look up to.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, it's the everyday people, right? Like what you, Shirley, and my mom is definitely like the first on my list. She's just invested so much into my life and my growth, and yeah, just everything about her, and just the she has the biggest heart ever. And so I think that has allowed me to know when I'm experiencing love and know when that's real, right? Because I got to experience that from my mom, and she really showed that. And then, of course, it's community folks, right? It's Hmong women who are continuing to push the boundaries and bring our community to a higher consciousness. And I think that is so, that's just invaluable. Like, Hmong women are just heroes, and then lastly, people who I'm not even personally connected with, but have been doing this work, right? And I think about Miriam Kaba, and she's been thinking about how to end violence for a really long time. And she just has so much knowledge around that, and has been really thoughtful about how we look at punishment, right? Like why we're into punishment and what it does for us, and how do we look beyond that, right? And knowing that, we don't have to use violence to punish those that use violence. Like that just doesn't make sense, to use violence for somebody that caused violence. And then she, yeah, is just like moving us through how to transform harm, and to think about abolition, and to think about a different world of being. And for me, that is one of the most that is the biggest thing in instilling hope, I think, and moving us through negativity, and knowing that there is a different way of being and a different way of living, and it doesn't have to be the way it is right now.
Mm. That is so true. Ladies, I so appreciate you sharing both your icons. Again, that's literally my favorite part because it's always, really exciting because like you said, they don't talk about their celebrities. That's, who we're taught to, that's who icons are, right, in this big world. But it's so nice for people to dig a little deeper and really reflect on those icons who've been in their life and really help shape who they are today. So it's been such a pleasure. I am going to include more information about transforming generations in in the bio of this conversation for people to get connected with you and your amazing work. And I really appreciate having you on the episode today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.